네, 여러분 안녕하십니까. 오늘 미래를 만나다의 아나운서 김재원입니다. 오늘은 아주 특별한 분을 모셨습니다. 세계 최대의 전자결제 기업이죠. 페이팔의 설립자이며 2004년에 페이스북에 초기 투자자로 50만 불을 투자해서 성공을 거둔 분입니다. 실리콘밸리의 마이더스의 손이라고 불리우는 피터 T를 모셨습니다. 실제로 페이스북뿐만 아니라 많은 신생기업들에게 초기 투자자로 참여하셔서 큰 성공을 거두기도 했는데요. 그를 왜 실리콘밸리의 기업 혁신가로 부르는지 오늘 강의를 듣고 나면 아실 겁니다. 그가 오늘 이 자리에서 여러분에게 미래를 만드는 비밀에 대해서 강연해 주시겠습니다. 여러분, 피터 T 대표를 큰 박수로 환영해 주십시오.
Well, thank you very much for that incredibly warm welcome. There are many different things I'd like to talk about today. Say a little bit about my book, 0 to 1, which is a book in which I try to explain everything that I've learned over the years about starting companies, startups, technology, and business more generally. And it's always a bit of a challenge to write a book about entrepreneurship or to teach about entrepreneurship because it is not a science. There is no science. There's no formula where if you follow these 7 steps, you will make $1 million or you will have a successful company. And everybody is always looking for a formula. And the problem is that, the next Mark Zuckerberg will not start a social networking site. The next Larry Page will not start a search engine. The next Bill Gates will not start an operating system company. And so if you are copying these people, you're in some sense not learning from them at all. And so what I try to do is approach this question indirectly, because the critical thing is to do something new that's never been done before. And the indirect questions are things like, what is a good business nobody has started yet? Or the more intellectual version of this question, which I think always makes for a fantastic interview question to ask people, is tell me something that's true that almost nobody agrees with you on. And this turns out to be a very hard question for people to answer. And it's hard because we always think you have to be really brilliant to come up with an answer. But I think many of us actually do have answers to this question, but we're embarrassed, we're uncomfortable to tell the answers to the person asking the question, because a good answer is one the person asking the question will disagree on. So if you say something like, our political system is screwed up, our educational system does not work, everybody already agrees with these answers. Those are not interesting or good answers. The good answers are ones that people will not want to hear. And I think we live in a world in which courage is in far shorter supply than genius. So what I'd like to do in my comments today is give a few of my answers to this question, things that I believe to be true that most people do not agree with me on, and then get people thinking about looking at the world in slightly different ways. We are always taught to compete, that if you want to succeed, you need to compete. And my single overarching idea is that if you really want to succeed, you need to figure out how not to compete. That people mistakenly think that capitalism and competition are somehow synonyms. I think they are antonyms. A capitalist is someone who is in the business of accumulating capital because they're doing something nobody else is doing. They're offering a product nobody else is selling, so they can charge a good price for it. If you are in a world of perfect competition, you will make no profits. The profits will be all competed away. So if you want to compete like crazy, you should open a restaurant. And this is always my example for a terrible business. You'll have ferocious competition. You'll probably go out of business. Even if you do not go out of business, you will not do terribly well. And then a great company is always it always is what I call a monopoly. It's something where there's no competition at all. The example I give in my book of a great company is Google, where they've had very little competition in search for the last 12, 13 years, at least in the US and Western Europe. Korea is maybe a little bit different. And as a result, it's been making enormous amounts of profits for many years now. And I think this monopoly versus competition idea is the single most important business idea that people do not understand. And they don't understand it for a few different reasons. One is somewhat intellectual, because the companies that have monopolies never talk about it. So if you're running Google, if you're the CEO of Google, you will not go on TV and say, we have a fantastic monopoly. Because when you say that, the government will come after you very, very quickly. And so you will instead pretend that there's enormous amounts of competition and that you are not a search engine, but you are a technology company, which is much, much bigger than search. And so you are competing with the Android phones, with Apple, and you're competing with Facebook and Amazon, and you're building a self-driving car, so you're going to be competing with all the car companies in the world, and there's competition everywhere, and no, this is not the monopoly the government's looking for. So the people who actually have monopolies rarely talk about it, and it's always somewhat of a hidden truth as a result. And then on the other hand, if you're competing like crazy, you will also tend to want to downplay that a little bit too. So if you were to leave today's show and say, well, I'm not going to listen to anything Peter said, I'm just going to open that restaurant, as I'd always been planning to, you'd very quickly run into, nobody would want to give you money, it would be hard to get investors, and the basic challenge would be that you try to come with some fictional story how you're not competing, but the reality is it's just a restaurant and it's competition like crazy. So I think this truth gets obscured by everybody involved, and as a result is very poorly understood. And that's sort of the intellectual reason people don't understand the importance of monopoly. But there's also, I think, a somewhat more psychological reason that goes maybe a little bit deeper, which is that we're all somehow addicted to competition. We find competition incredibly validating psychologically. And I was very, very guilty of this when I was growing up in Northern California as a teenager and into my 20s, where it was sort of everything was tracked into one crazy competition after another. I remember my 8th grade junior high school yearbook. One of my friends wrote in, Peter, I know you're going to go to Stanford University in 4 years. 4 years later, I got into Stanford. I went to Stanford, and you sort of get in. You have another round in the tournament. Then I got into law school, which is a graduate school in the U.S. I got into Stanford Law School, and then I ended up at sort of a very prestigious law firm in New York City. And I never really asked why I was doing any of these things. It was just every time it was just you had to beat the people around you. You had to compete and beat people. And then it was this very strange place where on the inside, from the outside, it was a place everybody wanted to get in. On the inside, it was a place everybody wanted to get out. When I left after 7 months and 3 days, one of the people down the hall from me said they had no idea it was possible to escape from Alcatraz. They thought the firm was like a prison you could never get out of. But of course, all you had to do was go out the front door and not come back. But this was psychologically very hard for people to do because their whole sense of self-worth, their identity, everything they thought about themselves was wrapped up in all these competitions they had won over many, many years. The opening sentence in Anna Karenina, the Russian novel, is all happy families are alike, all unhappy families are unhappy in their own special way. And I think the opposite is true of business. I think that all happy companies are different because they found something unique to do. All unhappy companies are alike because they somehow failed to escape the essential sameness that is competition. When the chapter in my book entitled All Happy Companies Are Different was excerpted by the Wall Street Journal, they get to give it a different title. And they thought they needed a punchier title that had was a little bit edgier. And they changed the title from All Happy Companies Are Different to Competition is for Losers, which is very counterintuitive because we always think of the losers as the people who are not good enough at competing. The losers are the people whose grades are not quite good enough on the test scores, who are a little bit too slow on the athletic team. And we never think of the loser as perhaps the losers as people who are addicted so badly to competition, who are so obsessed with the people around them that they lose sight of anything transcendent, anything important, valuable, meaningful in the process. And I think that this sort of afflicts people on many, many different levels in many different forms. Henry Kissinger once described his fellow professors at Harvard, was talking about his fellow professors at Harvard University, and said, the battles in academia are so ferocious because the stakes are so small, which always seems like a definition of absolute insanity. Why would you fight like crazy over nothing at all? And on one level, it is an absolutely insane situation. On another level, it's just a logic of a certain situation where the logic is that if you can't differentiate yourself from the other person, the stakes get very small. If you're fighting like crazy, if you want it no matter what, you don't have to get paid very much. And so it's both insane and the deep logic of a certain situation. You know, there's a strange phenomenon in Silicon Valley where many of the people who've been successful entrepreneurs seem to be suffering from a mild form of Asperger's or something like that. They seem to be socially a little bit maladapted in one way or another. And I think we need to always take this fact and turn it around into a critique of our whole society. We need to ask the question, why is anybody who's normal, anybody who's not suffering from Asperger's at a disadvantage, where your original ideas, your interesting thoughts, you'll be talked out of exploring them before they're even fully formed, because you will pick up on all these social cues from people around you, and it'll be, oh, that's a little bit too strange, that's too weird, no, you probably shouldn't do that, probably just safest to go back and open that restaurant like everybody else. And I think this is something that's very deep in human nature. Already in the time of Shakespeare, the word ape meant both primate and to imitate. And there is something about human nature where imitation is a very deep aspect of what we do. It's how we learn language as children, by copying our parents. It's how culture is transmitted in our society. But it also leads to many forms of insane behavior. It leads to crazy peer pressures when we're young. It leads to the madness of crowds. It leads to, ape-like, sheep-like, lemming-like, herd-like behavior. It leads to market bubbles and all sorts of forms of insanity. I've often thought that that the anti-Asperger group, if you say, what are people who are the anti-Aspergers, I often think those are like business school students, where these are people who are super extroverted, they're socially very well adapted, they have very few convictions typically, so they're a little bit low on the conviction side. In the US, when you have an MBA program, you take all these people and you put them in the same place for 2 years, and they talk to one another for 2 years to try to figure out what they're going to do next, which is kind of a difficult thing since nobody has any idea what to do next, since they're all there because they don't know what to do next. And then they've done these studies at Harvard Business School where they found that the largest cohort from every class does the precisely wrong thing. It's like they're all trying to catch the last wave. In 1989, the largest group wanted to work for Michael Milken, who was involved in all the junk bonds in the 80s. It was 1 or 2 years later, he went to jail. They were never interested in technology, except for 99, 2000, when they descended on Silicon Valley, just as the dot-com bubble was about to come to an end. And so it's sort of the systematic bias to do all the precisely wrong things. And while it's easy to make fun of business school students, I think we have to realize that we're all subject to these pressures to a tremendous degree. When we look at advertising on television, people often think to themselves, look at that stupid ad. Who are the dumb people who fall for that? And the very disturbing truth is that it is all of us. We're all incredibly prone to these kinds of things. We're incredibly subject to this. Now, there are sort of a number of implications for business of this monopoly idea when you sort of try to apply it in founding a company and investing or joining, picking the right company to join. And one sort of very counterintuitive idea is we're often told in business that you should go after very big markets. But what I think you always want to go after is a large market share, because that's a monopoly, is you have a large percent share of the market. And so when you start a new company, you're starting small, so you want to start with very small markets so you can quickly get to a big share. When PayPal started, payments is a huge, huge space, but we went after a very narrow problem of eBay power sellers, about 20,000 merchants on eBay, no obvious solution. We had a much better solution than anything else they could do, and you went from 0 to 35% market share in 3 months. That was a very auspicious start. Facebook started with 12,000 people at Harvard University. It was such a small market that if you'd written this up as a business plan, nobody would have invested. They would have said the market's way too small. And you went from 0 to 60% market share in 10 days. Again, a very, very promising start. And then you sort of grew in concentric circles and scaled it from there. One of the questions I often get asked are, what are some trends that I see in technology? Where do I see things going in the years ahead? And I always dislike answering this question because I'm not a prophet. I can't foretell what is going to happen. Or I can give sort of very banal answers. I can say things like, there will be more cell phones used in 5 years or something, but that's not very interesting. It doesn't actually help in any way. But one thing that I would suggest is that almost every trend that people talk about, I believe, is overrated, exaggerated, and should be highly questioned. And so in Silicon Valley, there's a trend around healthcare IT software and education software. These are overrated. There is a very strong trend around SaaS, enterprise software, extremely overrated. If you hear the words big data, cloud computing, you need to run away as fast as possible. You need to just think this is fraud and just run away. And the reason you should be scared of buzzwords is that the buzzwords, they are like a tell in poker. They're an indication that you're bluffing and that there's no real business and that it's not differentiated, because the buzzword tells you that you're doing something in a category in which many other people are already doing it. The category is well understood because it's often been discussed by different people. And so if you are the 20th or the 100th company in a given category, people will very easily understand the category, but it's a symptom of things somehow being very off. And so if you have like a whole concatenation of these buzzwords, so we're building a mobile platform for SaaS software in the cloud using big data. That's sort of like an indication that something's very, very amiss, very off, because you never want to be, you don't want to be the 4th online pet food company, the 10th thin film solar panel company, the 5,000th restaurant in Seoul, Korea. This is always the sort of thing that one needs to resist. I think the really great companies, the ones that are underrated, are often the ones that don't fit into any categories at all. And we do not even have the language, we don't even have the words to describe what people are doing. And so it's often a tremendous challenge, even for the people founding these companies, to explain what it is they're doing. And they tend to be somehow very underestimated, certainly by the investors and by the rest of the world, and then they gradually scale. And there are, of course, many subtle nuances to this. Sometimes you have categories where things are mislabeled within a category. So in the late 90s, Google described itself as a search engine, and people could have said, well, there are already so many search engines. It's just another one, this category that already exists. But I would argue that was actually been the wrong category. Google was not a search engine. It was a computer-powered search, very different from human-powered search. With the PageRank algorithm, it was something fundamentally different. So if you labeled it a search engine, you would have lost sight of what was unique, what was essential, what was valuable. Facebook always gets characterized as a social networking site. One of my friends, Reid Hoffman, who ended up starting LinkedIn years later, back in 1997, started a company called SocialNet. So they had social networking in the name of the company 7 years before Facebook, in 1997. And they had all these theories on how to do it. It was going to be in cyberspace, and you'd have these fake alternate persona, and maybe one person would be a cat and one person would be a dog, and you'd have to figure out how the two of you would interact in cyberspace. And this turned out not to be what people were interested in at all. They were not interested in fictional alternate persona. They were interested in real identity. And real identity was the problem that needed to be solved. Facebook was the first company to crack real identity, whereas networking in the abstract, not that interesting. You don't really want to spend all your time networking with cats and dogs or something like that. And so I think these are all these sorts of perspectives that one comes to in thinking through this, in really rethinking this competition idea. I want to maybe close by offering one other sort of slightly contrarian thought on a somewhat bigger picture scale. I think that if the 21st century is going to be a successful century, it will involve both globalization and technology. And I always think of these two things as very different kinds of things. The words often get used almost interchangeably, but I think they're very different. I think of globalization. I draw it on the x-axis. It is copying things that work. It's going from one to n. It's horizontal or extensive growth. And I think of technology. I draw that on the y-axis. It's doing new things. It's going from 0 to 1. It's intensive or vertical progress. And so, globalization is going from 1 to 100 typewriters. Technology is going from a typewriter to a word processor. And there's obviously room for some of both in our world. But it's worth reflecting that in the last 200 years, there have been periods of globalization and periods of technology, and they do not precisely overlap. I think 19th century, you had a lot of both globalization, where the world became much more connected, and a lot of technological progress. But after 1914, start of World War I, world becomes much more divided. There's less trade. Parts of the world become communist. And so you end up with globalization goes very much in reverse starting in 1914. But technology continues on many, many fronts for many decades. And then in recent decades, and I would date this to the Kissinger trip to China in 1971, globalization starts again, and we've had a ferocious amount of globalization the last 40 years. But I would argue that we've had more limited technological progress. And in fact, the word technology now means only information technology. It means, first semiconductors, then computers, internet, mobile internet. Whereas in the 1950s and 1960s, technology meant many other things. It meant spaceships and supersonic airplanes. It meant new forms of energy. It meant underwater cities. It meant new forms of agriculture, the Green Revolution in agriculture. It meant new materials, new pharmaceuticals, new medical devices. And so there has been, and while I think the computer revolution has been quite strong, there are many other areas where I think we've had more limited progress. And so the 19th century was a period of both globalization and technology. The 20th century, first part, 1914 to 71 approximately, globalization goes in reverse, but you still have a lot of technology. And then the more recent part, the last 40 or so years, a lot of globalization, but more limited progress on technology. And I think this is in part reflected in our culture, US and Western Europe especially, which is, I think at this point, completely opposed to science and technology. And even though we always say that we're in favor of it, I think the reality is that our culture dislikes science and dislikes technology very intensely. And the easiest way to see this is to look at all the science fiction films that come out of Hollywood. And they show technology that doesn't work, that kills people, that destroys the world, that is dystopian, and it's one technologically bad thing after another. And the future is some combination of the movies, Avatar or Elysium, or The Matrix, or maybe the Terminator movie with robots running around killing people. I watched the Gravity movie the other day, which was sort of the space station, outer space. everything goes wrong. You would never want to go into outer space. You are really happy to be back on the muddy tropical island somewhere. And of course, I'm not blaming Hollywood here, because I think it just reflects the broader culture for the most part. And it's just an indication of how the broader culture doesn't want science or technology. And that's why I think the real counterculture in our society today, in the Western world, in the developed world today, is the part that's pushing science and technology, because most of our culture, most of our society actually wants to see things not change or hold things back. If you frame this idea in geopolitical terms, in the 1950s and 1960s, you would have divided the world into the first world and the third world. First world was that part of the world which was technologically progressing. The third world was sort of permanently screwed up. Today, you would divide the world into the developed and the developing countries. And so this is a dichotomy that is very pro-globalization. The developing countries are those countries that are copying the developed countries, and they're all sort of converging. The world's becoming more and more homogenous. It's all sort of becoming the same as you have this convergence, pro-globalization story that runs through it. But it's also the case that this way of talking about our world is implicitly anti-technological, because when we say that we live in the developed world, then we are saying that those of us in the United States or Western Europe or South Korea, we're saying that we're living in that part of the world that's done, finished, where nothing new is really going to happen. It is, after all, fully developed, and where the younger generation should have reduced expectations for the future from their parents and their grandparents. And I think this is a conception of our society that we should resist very powerfully. And so I will end by asking the contrarian question that I think needs to be asked far more often. How can we go about developing our so-called developed world? Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much for coming out to our show. It was really great. We really enjoyed it. How was the Korean audience?
Really, it was a great audience. I hope it will continue to be a great audience for the rest of the program, though. So I wouldn't, if it was a bad audience, I wouldn't tell you.
Okay, that's because
I tell people things that they don't want to hear, but I would never say that.
Oh, really?
I'd be careful about that, yes.
Okay. Oh, give them a big applause. Okay. Thank you. We're going to take some questions. Actually, I've got a questions list. 문경록 씨 어디 계신가요? 네.
My question is, some people say that having a job experience in a big company before starting start a business, while others say it's better to start a business as soon as possible without any job experience. As a serial entrepreneur and venture capitalist, what do you think about that?
Well, I would say that there's always sort of both talent and some experience that can be valuable. The challenge is that in many contexts you learn the wrong lessons. So it's possible that experience can even be somewhat counterproductive, where you learn that things. When we started PayPal, we had very little experience in the payments industry. And there were people in the payments industry who had experience. They told us it was a bad idea. You were going to have enormous amounts of fraud. We said there would be no fraud. PayPal's a friendly name. We won't have any. All the people will be honest. It turned out that was not true. There was actually a lot of fraud, but then it was a problem that we solved as we went along. Whereas if we'd had a lot of experience, we might never have started, because we would have been discouraged by what we thought were these unsolvable problems. So there are sort of a lot of complicated dynamics that are at work. I think starting a company is always a somewhat crazy thing to do. It's a really and I don't think people should become entrepreneurs for its own sake. One of my friends once told me a few years ago, that he wanted to be an entrepreneur in 5 or 10 years' time. I think that's always a terrible idea. It's like saying, I want to be rich or I want to be famous. You don't start a company for its own sake. You start a company because you've come across a very important problem that somehow cannot be solved by any other means. It can't be solved within a big company because it's too bureaucratic or too slow. It's not going to be solved by nonprofit or government. And so you start a new company only when there are important problems that cannot be solved elsewhere.
Okay, this is another question. I think there are so many entrepreneurs in this world. I mean, even in Korea. Do we need them still more? I mean, even a lot more?
Well, I would say we need more good entrepreneurs. So my, and I think, like, again, I'm not in favor of starting companies for its own sake. So it's sort of like if everybody had a startup in this audience and we all started companies, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's not measured by the number of companies. It's not the quantity, but it's the quality. And so I think we need more good companies, and I think we need more good entrepreneurs. And I do think there's room for a lot more new things we could be doing. I think we have had a lot of good companies started in IT. I think there's always a question whether we could be doing a lot more in many other areas as well.
You must be a good entrepreneur.
We like to invest in good entrepreneurs. Yes, we like to do that.
So just imagine. Let's go with past. You are an 18-year-old boy, and you've got a Stanford admission, and also you've got a great idea to be a monopoly in this business world. What would you do? Would you go to Stanford or would you build a company?
You can't, it's a little bit unfair to run the experiment twice like this because, in fact, I did not have a great idea when I was 18 years old, so I just went to Stanford. And so it's always, certainly if you go back and you tell your younger self things, there's all sorts of advice you could give. I might not have listened to any of the advice I would have gotten, but I think the better question is often, what could you have known at the time? Not in some really fictional version, but what could you have actually known at the time? And if I had to do something over again, I might still go to Stanford, I might still go to Stanford Law School, but I would ask a lot more questions why I was doing it. And when I look back on it, I think I was very motivated by status, by prestige, and in retrospect, I would have asked a lot more questions. What was the purpose of the education? What was the aim for it? And I think one of the things that's true in all these sort of super tract societies, Korea as well as the United States now, is that somehow your 18th year of your life is by far the most important year. That's when you find out where you get into college. And it's the only year of your life that seems to matter. And this is a very strange picture of life because most of us aren't going to die at age 18. We still have many years ahead of us. And we should be thinking a little bit about what we're going to be doing with the rest of our lives as well. One of my good friends who got into Yale University, another elite university in the US, he was 17 when he started there. And the dean welcomed the students and told the students, congratulations, you're at Yale, you're set for life. And he thought to himself, that's a little bit odd since I'm only 17 years old. And so I think this idea that we're automatically saved if we get a diploma from the right college, that's something we should question a lot, and we should realize that it can be valuable. It can be, it's definitely an achievement to have gotten in, but it cannot be the be-all and end-all of your life because otherwise you're going to be spending the next 70 years talking about how you got into college, and because there will be nothing else you will have done for the rest of your life. There's a line about Rhodes Scholars, the Rhodes Scholarship in Britain. All Rhodes Scholars had a great future in their past. Yeah. So they got a Rhodes Scholarship, and they got it because they had all this potential for the future, but then nothing ever happened with it for the most part because they thought, now that I have a Rhodes Scholarship, I don't really need to do anything.
Okay. The truth is that you don't have to go back to past. Okay.
It's hard to, and we don't have a time travel machine yet, so that's a bit of a limitation.
Okay.
Korea is very competitive, education-oriented country in a sense, and the grades and scores are super, important for students as well as probably everyone in this room as well. So it's extremely difficult to get away from the sentiment, and I was wondering what you think about how we the education is wrong and how we should address that, competitive environment in education. We appreciate your opinion.
I think a lot of it, we have to sort of understand there are sort of ways people talk about education on the surface, and then there's a reality of what's going on beneath the surface. And so I think the surface level in the US is that education is about learning. It's all about how good it is to learn things, to become an educated person, and then, and how this will help you in all these different ways. And then I think beneath the surface, part of it's, of course, a competitive tournament, but I think a lot of it is motivated by fear. And there's this incredible fear that if you do not win in the tournament, you will fall through these very big cracks in our society. And that's, so I think that's, in some sense, that's what's real. If it's really being driven by fear, we have to figure out ways to address those fears. And so how do we create a society where people do not just fall through the cracks if they don't get into the right college at age 18? And you're not going to solve it, you're not going to get rid of those fears by just saying everyone has to study more to get into the right college. The system is designed so that most people will fail, right? It's a zero-sum system. If you were the president of Harvard University, if you wanted to get all the students and all the faculty and all the alumni to come after you with pitchforks and to try to fire you on the spot, what you should do is you should propose doubling the enrollment. And you say, we have a great education for 12,000 people. We can obviously make it available for 24,000. And everybody who was going to Harvard would be really angry at you because it would make their degree less valuable. Their degree, it's a system of exclusion. The value comes from the fact that people are being excluded from this process. And that's, of course, a reality that's very different from the surface, where it's all learning is positive sum. If I learn something, you can learn something too. It's all sort of increases the body of knowledge in the world, when it's really, the reality is that it is this crazy zero-sum tournament. So I don't really know how the system, how to change it or how exactly it will change. I think it would be good to have a system where there's not a single, just one single approach that gets used, and where we have a wider variety of different things, where there are different people can do different things and succeed in different ways, and that's what I hope will happen in the future. And so if I were to replace it with an alternative unitary system of my own, I think I would just be replicating the whole screwed up structure that we already have, because there are not enough people who can get in, and there are all these student debts with it. There's all this stuff that's getting more and more screwed up. The analogy I've given is that I think it's similar to the Catholic Church circa 1500, where, and it's sort of like an atheistic church, where it's sort of, if you get a college degree, you will be saved. If you do not get a degree from college, then you will go to hell. And the future, and I think the disturbing thing is that there is no institution that will save people, and you have to figure out how to work out your own salvation. And I think that's what the future of education will be like.
제 질문은 창업가나 기업가뿐 아니라 세상 사람 누구나 이 개인의 인생에 있어서 제로 투 원 챌린지를 하고 싶거나 또는 해야 되는 그런 사람 상황에서 그 용기와 또 그 두려움을 가지고 고민하는 사람들이 있습니다. 그런 분들을 위한 한마디를 부탁드려 보겠습니다.
Is that it's never you against the whole world. And so in a successful business, successful startup, there's always a team of people. And so the initial, one of the initial questions is always, how do you get that team together? You may be able to beat all the other students on a test just by yourself. You can't create a great company just on your own. This is always a bit of a team effort. And so I think one of the critical initial questions is, how does one assemble the right team? How do you get the right people together? And I think it's often people with common interests, common vision, a common history, I think often helps. One of the questions I like to ask entrepreneurs is, when they're an early stage company, I like to ask the prehistory question. How do they meet? How did the company get formed? A bad answer would be, we just met each other a week ago at a networking function. We all wanted to start companies, and we decided to just team up. No particular reason, but just that's what we did. A good answer is, we've been friends for 3 or 4 years. We've been working together. We've been thinking about this for a long time. One of us is more on the technical side, one's more on the business side. That's sort of something that has a more organic feel. But I don't think it's like a single moment. It's a journey. There are many ups and downs, and so to avoid it collapsing on the various low points you have, the internal dynamics are very important.
How old were you when you graduated from Stanford?
I've been 21 undergrad, 24 law school.
Okay, 24. Could 24-year-old Peter Thiel have known enough to establish a goal to build a future in your life?
He could have thought about it a lot more. He did not have my book available, but no. Seriously, he could have. There was certainly when I look back on that point in my life, there were all these ways that I was not thinking about the future. I thought it was automatically set because of the institutions I'd gone through, and so I do think I could have spent a lot more time thinking about what I wanted to do, who I wanted to work with. The internet boom was already getting started in the early 90s, and I was in Silicon Valley, so there was a way in which there was definitely more that one could have done. I think we all we can't do everything, or we can't there's some things you cannot do, but I think there is always sort of a lot more potential than we think. So we always have excuses. Can't do this, can't do that. There's no time that's the right time to start a company. It's probably always a bad time to start, for that matter. It's a bad time when you're 24. It's a bad time when you're 65. It's just always a bad time to start. It's always hard. It's getting the initial capital tends to be very difficult. It's sort of like and you have this sort of crowd effects with investors, where people want to invest when other people are investing. They don't want to invest when no one's doing it. So how do you get the first people to give you money? We raised $500,000 at PayPal in February of 1999, and then 13 months later, the company had scaled, and we raised $100 million in March of 2000. The first $500,000 was by far the hardest, much harder than $100 million 13 months later. And it was, you'd meet with these individual investors. Maybe I'll give you $25,000. You're eating in a Chinese restaurant. You get the fortune cookie, and the investor will say, well, I'll invest if the fortune cookie says something good. Of course, the fortune cookie said something good, and of course, they still did not invest. And so it's just very hard to get these things started, no matter what time you do it.
Actually, is still there totally new business nobody built in? Could be a monopoly? Do you think so, actually?
There always could be.
Oh, really?
Always could be new businesses created.
What could be the next one?
Well, if I knew that, I would already be invested. I'd already be starting it. But I think it's always good to look at places people are not looking at. There's likely to be. Let me start by saying I think there's likely to be just continued innovation in information technology, because this is an area where there's been lots happened, and there's no reason to think that's going to stop today. It's been breakneck innovation in IT for the last 40 years. I'm always tempted to look in all these other areas, and so one sector that people I think are not doing nearly enough on in the U.S. is in the life sciences, and there's actually there's a lot of basic research that's been done. There's a lot of interesting things that could be brought to market. There's some regulatory challenges. There are a lot of different challenges, but when I look at the businesses, I always get the sense that there's far more that we could be doing. Right? And I think this is true of many different fields. But it's never. But you never want to frame it as an abstract category. So it's not, I'm going to start a monopoly company. All right, no, I'm going to start a monopoly company in IT. That's a little bit better, but still not very good. I'm going to start a monopoly company in IT, in big data and cloud computing. We're still using too many buzzwords. So it's always very particular, very fact specific. And the formula is, it's something you're passionate about, you're good at, and that for some reason other people haven't thought about yet and are not looking at.
They are finding a business having potential to be a monopoly, including me. Could you give us a tip
Well, you start with small markets. In the technology sector, you always want to do something that's a lot better than the next best thing. So not just a small improvement. You want to go for big improvements, but then it's always a fact-specific thing. There is no formula. If there was a formula, then other people could do it, and if other people could do it, it wouldn't be a monopoly. So if I could tell you exactly what to do, that would almost certainly be bad advice.
Yeah, so you mean I need to think differently?
You have to think for yourself.
Yeah.
I know it might hurt, but you have to think for yourself.
So how would you give us how to think better as well as differently?
My formula that I will repeat is there is no formula. So there is no formula. It's like people often ask me, what book should I read? Okay, you should read my book. Then after that, what other books should I read? And no, you should read books that you're interested in, that you're passionate about. And it's not that everyone should read the same book or everyone should do the same thing. Because if you're doing that, you already know that can't be right. There are 20,000 people a year in the US who move to Los Angeles to become movie stars. And they're all very talented, they're very passionate about it, but it's probably a bad idea because there's too much competition. Maybe 20 people out of 20,000 make it. So so you always want to think about how many people are trying to do this, and how differentiated is it from, and that's always a critical question. So it's always, are there some blind spots? Are there some reasons people are not looking at certain things systematically? And there have been, and you look at all these companies that have been created, sometimes there was brilliance involved. Often it was not that brilliant, but it was somehow just something people hadn't quite pulled together, hadn't quite done. And the fact that there are so many great business ideas that didn't even require brilliance, I think that tells you how much potential there is.
Okay, I'm going to read your book again.
만약 한 5살에서 7살 정도의 아이가 있다고 가정을 하시고, 만약에 그 아이가 많은 사회에서 많은 것들을 접할 텐데 그 중에서 어떤 것들을 배우고 또 앞으로 나아갈 방향을 어떻게 잡았으면 하는지 그거가 궁금합니다.
I think software, things related to computers, are going to be a continued core thing that people should learn. It's like it's probably like learning a language, and instead of just learning foreign languages, we should maybe also learn a few computer-related languages. There is probably a point where learning language is often much easier when you're young rather than when you're old, and there's a question whether there's an aspect of computer programming that's like learning a language where you can do that really well when you're actually quite young. But I think more generally, I would say that the thing I would want them to unlearn is this idea that I already alluded to earlier, that your life ends at age 18, that the only year of your life that matters is your 18th year. I think your 5th year and your 7th year matter, and then all the years in between matter, and the years after you're 18 matter tremendously. And so we should orient education not just towards getting into the best university, but towards being the most successful in life. University is 4 years. Life is generally much, much longer than that.
Actually, when I was a child, I really enjoyed the board game Monopoly. Yeah. Do you know?
I liked it too, yes.
Yeah. Actually, it was just kind of land collecting, right? At the time, I almost won, but I'm nothing right now. So I'm just wondering how I can teach them to Monopoly concept, to the kids, if you're a dad.
Well, the Monopoly game that's in my mind always a bad form of Monopoly because a bad Monopoly is one where it's like a tax, or you're like a troll collecting a toll at a bridge, or the Monopoly game, everything is set, everything is fixed. The streets are fixed, the properties are fixed, and they just get shuffled among different players. And so in a static world, in a world where nothing changes, monopolies are exploitative and deserve the bad reputation they have. The good monopolies, I think, are ones that create new things, that that develop new things in one way or another, and that have sort of a dynamic character. So when Steve Jobs created the iPhone, it was the first smartphone that really worked. And this was not creating artificial scarcity, but it was creating a new category of thing that didn't even exist before. And so I think there are good monopolies, bad monopolies. The monopoly game is a little bit closer to the bad monopoly category. I would say, I do think that we don't generally learn very much about business as a category. Even though this is, so I'm not exactly sure how one would teach this or how one would think about this, but it is probably a category that is very important to much of what we end up doing with our lives. And even if you do not start a business, it ends up being a very important question what business you join. And so I think understanding this monopoly idea is valuable not only for a founder or maybe an investor, but also really valuable if you as you figure out what company to join. Should I go work in the restaurant or should I go work at the monopoly search engine company? And the second is probably much better than the first.
So you can make new board game with good monopoly concept.
Designing board games is pretty hard. It's very competitive too. It's very competitive.
Okay, it's not your thing.
그 독점 같은 게 되게 이제 중요하다고 말씀을 하셨는데 그 사실 독점적인 지위를 가지고 있는 기업이라면은 미래에는 잠재적인 경쟁자들을 피할 수가 없을 것 같거든요. 그러면은 이런 그 독점적인 지위를 유지하기 위해서는 어떻게 하는 것이 좋을까요?
It's a critical question how long it can be maintained over time. And I think it's some combination of intellectual property. Sometimes you have network effects, you have economies of scale. There's a lot around software where, and I think this is one of the reasons software has been so appealing to people, because when you succeed in building a great software business, you can get to scale very quickly. The marginal costs of software are very low. And then it's often fairly sticky and fairly locked in, so it can be maintained for a while. But I think the premise of the question is a good one. We always talk in Silicon Valley about a first mover. You have to be the first to market, the first mover. And I think that is important. But I think it is equally important to be the last mover. And if you're the last company in a category, in a sector, that's actually really valuable. Microsoft was the last operating system. Google, in some sense, is the last search company. And so in chess, to use a chess analogy, if you play white in chess, you are the first mover, and you have a small advantage. It's about 1/3 of a pawn advantage if you start with white. But it was the world chess champion Capablanca who said that you must begin by studying the end game. If you want to become really good, you have to think about how things end, how it goes in the long run, because what matters is winning the end game, not just getting some fast moves in at the opening where you get a small advantage.
So you mean we need to be a last mover to the
it's a hard question to think about, but that is the question. I would say it's always not just how do you get an advantage, but then how do you sustain and maintain it over time.
Sometimes maintaining is more important than the gaining.
Well, durability in practice, the durability of these businesses is where most of the value comes from. If you look at the cash flows these companies generate, it's typical that 3/4 or more of the value comes from cash flows a decade or more in the future. And so if you look at a company like Twitter, it's 75-80% of its market capitalization will come from profits it makes in years 2025 and beyond. And so if you're investing in Twitter or starting it or anything like that, one of the most important questions is, will it still be around 10 years from now? Because that's what decides most of the value.
Maybe how would you advise to young generation to track right type of mentor?
It's again, the challenge is that it's by definition, the mentors won't actually know what to do.
Yeah.
And so, you can, there are people you can be inspired by, you can learn from, you can have advisors, but at the end of the day, the essential step you have to take yourself, and you have to, the new thing, the last step where you go into new uncharted territory, you have to go by yourself. It's like if you were an explorer and you're in the 17th, 18th century, and you're exploring the world, and you say, well, there are all these other explorers, and I know where they've gone on the maps. and you can follow them on the maps where they've already gone. But to actually become an explorer, you have to go to one of the places where nobody's been.
What has the purpose driven your life? Tree.
Oh, that's a hard question to answer. But it's day to day, it's extremely motivational just working with all these incredibly talented people. And then I do think the larger purpose is that I do think that we live in a time when it's very important for us to find ways to once again accelerate technological progress, to figure out a way to develop our developed world, to take our civilization to the next level, to leave the world as a much better place for the generations that come after us.
오늘 아주 특별한 시간을 가졌습니다. 이 실리콘밸리의 기업 혁신가 피터 틸 대표와 함께 새로운 미래를 만들어 봤는데요. 어떻게 보면 우리가 미래를 준비하고 있다고는 하지만 그동안 미래는 저절로 오는 것이겠지 하고 생각하지 않았었나 싶습니다. 그가 그동안 오늘을 만들어 왔던 과거의 방법을 통해서 우리는 또 차츰차츰 미래를 만들어 가야 되지 않을까 싶습니다. Okay, it could be final question. Would you advise us, actually final advice to build a future?
Well, it's worth all. I think it's worth. I think that's a great question because the way it's worded is precisely correct. So we sometimes have this view that the future is this thing that just exists out there. Ray Kurzweil has this book, The Singularity is Near, where you have this exponential progress and it's just going to happen. And I think this is the wrong view of the future, where it's not like a movie where you just have to sit back and eat the popcorn and the movie happens on its own. It's one we have to build, we have to create. If it's just a movie, I can't tell you what's going to happen. But if it's about human agency, about the choices we make, then we can build it. And so I think the very first step is to really understand that the future is ours to build. It's the choices we make today that will determine the future. It's not something that happens out there in the abstract. It's not a horoscope. It's not a soothsayer that can tell you what's going to happen. You can determine the future if you decide to build it.
Okay, it's time to start.
It's time to start building.
Okay, thank you. 함께해 주신 여러분 감사합니다. 우리 다시 한번 피터 틸 대표의 큰 박수 부탁드립니다. 감사합니다.